Reprise du débat. Continuing debate. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud to rise today and address the fall economic statement as delivered by our Canada's Minister of Finance over a week ago. But I want to go through some things in this speech, and I have to limit my comments because there's a lot to go through here, and I think the House will appreciate that I'm going to focus on a few things here. Number one, there's some good news here, and that good news, of course, is that Canada collected $30 billion in extra revenue, tax revenue, over last year. We can call that good news, but there's a dark side to it as well. But $30 billion more arrived in government coffers than we actually thought would going to be there last year, and that's really good forecasting on behalf of the Department of Finance and the Minister himself. So congratulations. But not to be outdone, of course, the Minister decided to spend an additional $16 billion of that $30 billion windfall that she put onto the backs of Canadians. Now, let's think about how government revenue goes up. Government revenue goes up in an inflationary environment because the price of everything goes up, and therefore their collection of revenue on everything goes up. Do people's actual paychecks go up? Absolutely not. So the government revenue's gone up in GST, in collections on excise tax, on income tax. All of this has gone up, corporate taxes as well. But the one main factor here that contributed $30 billion extra to this government's coffers was an increase in resource revenues. So resource revenues, the resource industry in Canada, because of a lack of resources, a scarcity of resources around the world, pricing and resource revenues went up in Canada, as it did everywhere else around the world, and Canada's resource industry provided more revenue to government, along with Canadians who were taxed more and gave more to Canadians. Inflationary taxes are one thing. Resource sector contributions are quite another. But Canadians need to realize this government is getting more revenue based on the fact that they're not doing as well. They don't have as much take-home pay. More of it's going into the government's hands. And still, a forecast deficit of $39 billion after a resource windfall that landed in the government's pockets. Forget about the effect continued spending will have on inflation, because government spending is the #1 cause for inflation. $500 billion over the past 2.5 years has caused excessive inflation in the Canadian economy. The overspending has been rampant. Our debt is double what it was before this government got into power. It is an anomaly in the world. We need to address it. The effect on Canadians in that respect, if you think about an average Canadian in an average house with an average mortgage, and I have to speculate here that that mortgage is going to be on a variable rate basis, will be an extra $7,000 per year because of the higher interest rates caused by the inflationary environment that the government has produced. $7,000 a year more on top of the taxes that are being paid more by Canadians and more to the banks. So who's doing well in this inflationary environment and who's not doing so well? Well, I can tell you right now, the Canadian taxpayers aren't doing that well. But the Minister has to acknowledge as well, and she does in her document, and I need to point it out very clearly to her here, $24 billion this year in debt service payments, $34 billion next year in debt service payments, and the year after, $44 billion from Canadians' taxes going into debt service payments. So from 24 to 44 because of an adjustment in interest rates and continued government overspending. $44 billion is more than the federal government gives to the provinces for health care. So this has become a major item in the government's balance sheet and an income statement. It is something we're going to have to address. I suggest we address it sooner rather than later. Perhaps that extra $16 billion the Minister found under her pillow here, she could have actually used for some debt reduction, so we wouldn't have that $44 billion bill, $20 billion higher than this year, 2 years from now. It's something that we do need to start focusing on. And she did use some words in her speech, and I read those words, I heard those words as well. She talked about prudent fiscal management. This is anything but prudent. She talked about keeping powder dry. I don't know how running a $39 billion deficit in a supposedly inflationary economy is actually keeping powder dry. It is burning your powder, so you don't have any powder to actually spend going forward. And just to say thanks to the main source of the windfall gains, the resource sector, the minister acquiesced to some shrill voices of public opinion and on her bench and on the benches of some of the other parties in this House. And she says, I'm going to have a 2% tax on the share buybacks that these industries are incurring in Canada. Now, I don't know where she's been for the last 7 years, but I can tell you that the companies that are doing share buybacks now are the companies that issued shares at far lower prices over the last 7 years. So they're reconfiguring their balance sheet back to where they were when they had a normal business environment and they didn't have to incur hundreds of billions of dollars of losses as an industry over 7 years. At that point in time, of course, there's some on the other bench that were saying, well, this is a sunset industry, and of course it's going to lose billions of dollars. And all of a sudden, 1 year it makes some money for its investors, and the government comes back and goes, well, we need to tax that back now because we don't want you buying back your shares from investors. We want you reinvesting that money in the Canadian economy. Well, how do you do both? How do you say, okay, here's an impetus to actually reinvest in the Canadian economy and not buy back shares after you've invested so much and taken so much money into your balance sheet because you had to in tough times in order to survive. But a 2% tax on share backs, think about that as far as how it affects everything in the world. It is flavor of the day in so many respects. You think about the 1% share buyback mechanism in the States. Not to be outdone, we doubled it here in Canada because, you know, the resource industry is much less important in Canada than it is in the United States. I say sarcastically. I hope that's reflected in the minutes that come here. But profits increased for a reason. Profits increased because an industry is actually cyclical. All our resources industries in the world are cyclical. And these things go up and these things go down. And you cannot take with one hand and not give back with the other if you're going to have a sustained industry going forward here. Now, here's the issue on investment in Canadian oil and gas. Oil and gas investment in Canada follows international oil and gas pricing. But not anymore. You take a look at oil prices, gas prices going up, but the investment's not happening in the Canadian economy anymore. That's because there is no longer an environment to invest. There's no longer transparency for Canadian companies to invest in their own industry, an industry that we prosper at and that we perform more environmentally friendly than any other industry in the world. This is something we should be proud of. And this is something we need to make sure that we do more of. But the result, of course, is less jobs for Canadians, less tax-paying jobs. So the minister could get out of the way and actually get more money into her coffers if she just allowed this to happen. Less jobs, less investment in Canada, less technology development in Canada, green technology development in Canada, less future taxes paid, a lower Canadian dollar because of this government's actions. And a lower Canadian dollar affects all Canadians because we get so many of our goods from other markets. And that means we're paying more Canadian dollars to get the same goods that cost the same in US dollars or British pounds or euros or won or yen, whatever we're importing at that point in time. We've devalued ourselves because of that, Madam Speaker. There's a lack of transparency in what this government wants to accomplish. Any industry that wants to build something in Canada is subject to an Impact Assessment Act now that has complete lack of transparency. And that means the critical minerals industry that this government vaunts is going, how on earth do we do this? We can't do this. You take a look at the example shown in our natural resource industry in the building a pipeline for liquid natural gas exports in Canada. We are slow in Canada. You take a look at who's prospered over the last decade. The U.S. has prospered mightily. They've prospered. Australia has. Qatar has. Mozambique, that beacon of investment in the world, Mozambique has prospered where Canada has not. And all with the opportunities that are inferior to Canada, except for one thing. Canada has an inferior regulatory regime. These investments are not coming back. and the minister's numbers show that. So in order to do better, we need to actually have a better fall economic statement. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate it.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, you know, in Windsor-Tecumseh, we refer to the fall economic statement as a worker's budget. And one of the items that's in there is the first time ever labor provision in the clean tax credits. We're going to be paying or providing breaks for investment, for companies that invest in communities like Windsor, if they pay their workers better and if they hire apprentices. I'd love to ask the honourable member what he thinks about the worker fall economic statement and about the labour provisions in the clean tech tax credit.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I'm glad my colleague asked me that question, because one thing I didn't get to in my speech is the trillions of dollars the minister speaks about that's available for investment in Canada and these clean jobs that are just going to come, because she's designing a Canada Growth Fund for that, like on top of the Canada Infrastructure Bank at $31 billion, on top of the Strategic Investment Fund at $7 billion spent so far, on top of the Clean Fuels Fund, on top of the Zero Emission Vehicles Fund. These are all billions of dollars of government going into artificial jobs. None of these jobs, net, are beneficial to the Canadian taxpayer, because we're throwing more money into acquiring them than they're actually going to pay taxes at the end of the day. So great, jobs are coming. Can we actually get some jobs that are actually economically sustainable? Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his intervention today. And I agree with him. What we all should be doing is working for jobs for workers, making sure that we have family-sustaining, unionized jobs across the country. And I think that this government has not done enough for Alberta. But I will say that the Alberta government, the Conservative Alberta government, has a $13 billion surplus, and yet they have not invested in our community. They have not invested in workers. In fact, Alberta is one of only 2 provinces that has fewer businesses operating today than pre-pandemic. So can the member agree that there is a opportunity for the federal government to do more, to invest more in Alberta? Because when we see governments like our provincial government not invest in Albertans, not invest in Alberta workers, what happens is the jobs leave and we end up with massive surpluses that don't help Albertans, don't help Canadians.
Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I'll challenge my colleague on that assertion, because yes, this year Alberta did have a surplus, largely because of excess resource revenues. That one-year budget surplus combats a 6-year budget deficit, large budget deficits, and I say the deficits that Alberta incurred over the last number of years significantly eclipse the surplus. The wise decision any government should make at this point in time, when it finds a windfall surplus like that, is to pay down the debt it incurred in those times of challenge, if you will. And now we've got 1 year where actually, okay, get some money here. Don't throw it back at programs. The Alberta economy, my last numbers on it say it's the best performing economy in Canada as far as getting jobs back. So yes, spending more money is just government money that will inflate things as opposed to actually create any sustainable jobs. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Langley Eldergrove.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Calgary Centre for his well thought out and well researched speech. In her speech introducing the fall economic statement a couple of weeks ago, the Liberal Minister of Finance highlighted once again the lack of productivity in Canada's economy, something that she called the Achilles heel, a well-known gap. This is my question to my colleague. Does he see anything in this fall economic statement that is going to have any meaningful impact in narrowing the gap of our productivity numbers as compared to our trading nations?
Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
I very much thank my colleague for that question. It's a very good question. And actually, right in the minister's document herself, she actually presents the case that Canada's investments from private sector investment is still 10% below the amount it was when her government came into power, and it has consistently been there. It went down to 20% below, of course, in COVID, but that was fell worldwide. But we are still 10% below where every other country in the G7 and the G20 has rebounded significantly. So this is something that the government's trying to replace investment money with government money, and it's not working. and they need to kind of take the lesson that no matter how many billions of taxpayer money they throw at the wall here, it's not going to create an investment opportunity that's going to bring capital here for anything more than a subsidy. We need to get sustainable jobs back here in Canada that are productive.
Resuming debate.